You wake at 3 and nothing is wrong. Your bedroom is dark, your body is still, your house is silent, and you are completely, uselessly awake, staring at a ceiling you cannot see. You check the clock and it says what it always says. 3, or 10 past, or 1:45. The same window, night after night, as though something in you were keeping an appointment. This is not a metaphor. Your body is running a chemical schedule, measured in laboratories, timed to within minutes, and at that hour it does something specific. Your cortisol, the hormone that wakes you, reaches the bottom of its nightly curve and begins to climb. Your core temperature bottoms out. Your sleep pressure has largely discharged, and the deepest, heaviest sleep of your night is already behind you. You are not broken, not defective, not uniquely cursed among sleepers. You are on time. You know the room. Everyone who has been awake at that hour knows it. The particular quality of the darkness, thicker than evening dark, with the streetlight making the same shape on the ceiling it always makes. The sound of the house settling, a pipe somewhere, a car 3 streets away that you would never hear at noon. The person beside you breathing, in a rhythm that seems impossibly slow and untroubled, and the clock, which you should not look at, and which you look at anyway, telling you that there are 4 hours left and that you will spend them like this. There is a specific loneliness to that hour, and it is not because you are alone. It is because everyone you could call is asleep, and the world has withdrawn, and for a while you are the only one awake in it. That feeling is so consistent, so widely reported, so identical across cultures and centuries, that it deserves to be treated as data rather than as mood. Something happens to human beings at 3 in the morning, and it has been happening for as long as there have been human beings. It happens to almost all of us, in almost the same way, and we have been taught to interpret it as a personal failure, a sign of stress, a symptom to be medicated away. Tonight, we are going to take it seriously as a phenomenon and follow it into the sleep laboratory, into 5 centuries of historical documents, and into the practices of people who set alarms for exactly this hour and considered it the best part of the day. The real biology does not tell you that waking at 3 means something is wrong with you. It tells you something far stranger, that for most of human history, this was not a symptom, it was the schedule. There is a body of historical evidence, gathered from more than 2,000 references across 5 centuries of documents, showing that people in the pre-industrial world did not sleep the way you assume humans have always slept. They went down early, slept for several hours, and then woke in the dead middle of the night on purpose for an hour or 2, and they had a name for the sleep that came before and the sleep that came after. And when a research team at the National Institutes of Health took modern people and removed artificial light from their evenings for a few weeks, those people drifted, without instruction, into exactly that pattern. Your 3 in the morning may not be a malfunction, it may be an inheritance, still running in you, in a world that no longer has anywhere to put it. Sit with the size of that claim, because it is not a small one. If it is right, then one of the most common complaints in modern medicine, reported by tens of millions of people, treated with prescriptions and supplements and worry, is not primarily a disorder at all. It is a normal human sleep pattern, occurring in a culture that has forgotten it exists, and therefore experienced as alarming by the person having it, and diagnosed as pathological by the person treating it. The waking is not the problem. The interpretation of the waking is the problem, and the anxiety that follows the interpretation is what turns an hour of quiet into an hour of suffering. That is a claim you should not accept on my word, and by the end of tonight you will have the evidence in your hands, the archives, the experiment, the biology, and the objections. But notice now, before any of it, what happens in your body when you wake at 3 and think something is wrong with me. Your heart rate rises. Your cortisol, already climbing, gets a further push. Your mind, searching for the danger it has just been told about, finds your finances, or your health, or your children. Within 90 seconds, a neutral biological event has become a crisis, and the crisis is now genuinely keeping you awake. The interpretation did that, not the hour. And the reverse is equally true, which is the practical promise of this whole night. A person who wakes at 3, recognizes the hour, and thinks, there it is, on schedule, tends to drift back down within 20 minutes. Same body, same chemistry, same darkness, different sentence in the mind. Here is what is coming tonight, so you can hold me to it. First, the machinery, the exact chemistry of your night, hour by hour, why the small hours belong to a hormone rather than to your worries, and what the sleep laboratories have measured about the state you are in right now. Second, the history, the strange, well-documented, largely forgotten fact that human beings used to wake in the middle of the night by design, what they did in those hours, when it vanished, and why. And third, the deeper question, the one that goes past biology, why the mind at 3 in the morning is not the same mind you had at noon, why thoughts arrive at that hour stripped of their armor, and what the traditions, who deliberately woke people at exactly this time for over 1,000 years and called it worship rather than insomnia, understood about the hour you are currently lying awake in. And one more promise, because this channel does not sell comfort it cannot support. Near the end, I will give you the strongest reasons to think everything you are about to hear is wrong, at full strength. And a word about what this is not, before we go further, because it matters for anyone lying awake with real distress. This is not a claim that insomnia is imaginary, or that sleep problems do not need treatment. Chronic insomnia is a genuine condition that damages health and responds to genuine treatment, and if you are waking every night in dread, unable to return to sleep, exhausted through your days, that deserves a doctor rather than a documentary. Nothing tonight replaces that. What this is, instead, is an account of a single specific phenomenon, the ordinary, clustered, unexplained waking in the small hours, experienced by an enormous number of people who are otherwise sleeping and functioning fine, and who have been told, without evidence, that it means something is wrong with them. For that particular experience, the science and the history point somewhere unexpected, and knowing where can change the hour from an ordeal into something else. The distinction matters. One is a medical problem, the other is a misunderstanding, and misunderstandings can be corrected in a single night. But first the objection, at full volume, because you have probably already had it, and you deserve to have it taken seriously rather than skipped. Here it is. This is just stress. You wake at 3 because you are anxious about money, or your job, or someone you love, or your own health. And the reason it happens at 3 is nothing more mysterious than the fact that 3 is when the pressure of the day has worn off enough for the mind to surface. Add age, because sleep genuinely fragments as we get older. Add alcohol, add caffeine, add the light from a phone at 11. And you have a complete explanation with no ancient inheritance required. This objection is strong, and it is often correct. Anxiety, alcohol, pain, sleep apnea, and the ordinary changes of aging all fragment sleep, and if your waking comes with dread and lasts for hours, night after night, that is a medical matter, and no video is a substitute for a doctor. Nothing tonight will tell you otherwise. But hold one detail that the stress explanation cannot cover, and it is the detail that started this whole investigation. Why the same hour? Anxiety does not read clocks. Worry has no schedule. Grief does not check the time before it arrives. If the cause were simply a troubled mind, wakings should scatter across the night at random, and for some people they do. But for an enormous number of people, they do not scatter. They cluster in a narrow window with a precision that looks less like emotion and more like a timer. There is a second detail the stress account struggles with, and you can check it against your own experience. Ask people who wake at this hour what they were doing when they woke, and the honest answer is usually nothing. They were not dreaming about the mortgage. They did not startle awake from a nightmare. They simply surfaced into a quiet room, feeling ordinary, and only afterward did the worrying begin. The sequence matters enormously. The waking comes first, and the anxiety arrives to fill it. If anxiety were the cause, we would expect it to be present at the moment of waking. And for a great many people it is not. It walks in a few seconds later, looking for something to be about. That does not mean stress is irrelevant. A stressed body wakes more easily and stays awake longer, and there is good evidence that anxiety and poor sleep drive each other in a loop. It means the ordinary story has the order wrong. Something reliable and biological opens the door at a particular hour, and then worry, which is always waiting in the hallway, walks through it. Understanding that order is worth more than any sleeping pill, because it puts the anxiety back in its proper place, not as the cause of your waking, but as a passenger that boarded afterward. So let us look at the timer. Your night is not a flat stretch of unconsciousness. It is a scheduled sequence, and the schedule is chemical. It begins in a cluster of about 20,000 cells, sitting just above the crossing of your optic nerves, in a structure called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That cluster is the master clock of your body, and it runs on a cycle of roughly 24 hours, set every morning by the light that reaches your eyes. It governs far more than sleepiness. It schedules your body temperature, your digestion, your blood pressure, your alertness, and the release of the hormones that run your night. And it does all of this, whether or not you are aware of a single second of it. Every cell in you is keeping time. You are not a creature that happens to sleep at night. You are a rhythm. Think of it as the conductor of an enormous orchestra in which you have never met a single musician. Your liver keeps time. Your kidneys keep time. They filter differently at 4 in the morning than at 4 in the afternoon, which is why you can sleep through the night without rising. Your skin cells divide on a schedule. Your immune system mounts its patrols on a schedule. Your gut expects food at particular hours and complains when it does not arrive. The conductor sits above your optic nerves in a piece of tissue smaller than a grain of rice, and it takes its cue from one thing above all others: light entering your eyes, not the light you notice. There is a set of cells in your retina, discovered relatively recently, that are not involved in vision at all. They do not help you see anything. Their only job is to report to the clock how bright the world is, with a particular sensitivity to blue wavelengths, which is exactly what a screen emits into your face at 11 at night. Blind people who have lost all visual perception but retain these cells still keep normal circadian time. Some who lose them entirely drift, their internal day slipping later and later, sleeping out of phase with the world because the conductor has lost its cue. That is how deep this system runs. It is older than vision as we use it, older than the brain regions that think, and it is running your night whether or not you approve of the schedule. 2 hormones matter most for the hour you are lying awake in. The first is melatonin, which your pineal gland begins releasing when the light dims, and which does not knock you out, but rather announces to every system in your body that night has arrived. Its levels climb through the evening, peak somewhere in the deep middle of the night, and fall toward morning. The second is cortisol, and cortisol is the one that matters at 3. It is often called the stress hormone, which is true but badly misleading, because its more fundamental job is to wake you and mobilize you. Cortisol follows a daily curve of remarkable regularity. It is highest in the half hour after you wake, giving you the surge that gets you out of bed. It declines across the day. It reaches its lowest point in the middle of the night, and then, in the small hours, it turns and begins to climb again, hours before your alarm, preparing your body to be awake. Somewhere in that turn, in that rising edge, sits 3 in the morning. The exact timing shifts with your own clock. A person who naturally sleeps from midnight to 8 will find their turn at a different hour than one who sleeps from 10 to 6, which is precisely why the reported hour varies from person to person, while staying rigidly consistent for each individual. Your 3 might be someone else's 2 or 4. What matters is that it is always yours. The word stress has done real damage here, so let us translate it into something domestic. Cortisol is not a chemical of anxiety, it is a chemical of mobilization, the body's way of unlocking energy and making it available. It is what a deer uses to run, and what you use to get out of bed on a cold morning. And it is why the first cigarette or the first coffee feels different at 7 than at 3 in the afternoon. You are riding a wave that was already rising. Think of it as the house lights coming up in a theatre, slowly, from the middle of the night onward, so that by the time the alarm sounds the room is already half lit, and you can find your shoes. That gradual raising of the lights is called the cortisol awakening response, and it is one of the most reliably measured rhythms in human physiology. Now notice the implication for the hour you are lying in. When you wake at 3 and your heart is beating a little faster and your mind feels a little too available, you are not experiencing a stress attack that woke you. In many cases you are experiencing the house lights coming up, on schedule, in a theatre where the play is not supposed to start for another 4 hours. The alertness is real. The alarm you attach to it is yours. Now put the two together with a third factor, and you have the anatomy of your waking. Through the first half of the night, your body burns off what sleep researchers call sleep pressure. The accumulated drive to sleep that has been building since you woke yesterday, and this pressure is highest at the start of the night, which is why your deepest, heaviest, most unwakeable sleep comes in the first few hours. By 3 in the morning, most of that pressure has been discharged. Your core body temperature has fallen to its nightly minimum around this time. Your cortisol has bottomed and turned upward, and the architecture of your sleep has shifted. The deep, slow-wave sleep that dominated the early night has largely given way to lighter stages and to REM, the dreaming state, from which you are far more easily woken. If you have noticed that the dreams you actually remember tend to come from the second half of the night, this is why. That half is where the dreaming lives, and it is also where the surface is closest. So at 3 in the morning, you are simultaneously at your lowest pressure to stay asleep, at the turning point of your waking hormone, and in the lightest phase of your night. It is not a mystery that you wake. It is close to a scheduled event. And here is a fact from the sleep laboratories that almost nobody outside them knows. You wake far more often than you remember. Continuous recordings of ordinary healthy sleepers show brief arousals scattered through every night, dozens of them. Small surfacings that last seconds and leave no trace. Because memory does not encode anything during them. You surface, you sink, and in the morning you report an unbroken night. This happens to everyone, including the person beside you whose sleep you envy. The difference between a good sleeper and a bad one is often not the number of wakings, but whether the waking is long enough and conscious enough to be remembered and interpreted. Which means that what distinguishes your 3 in the morning from the same event in someone who claims to sleep straight through may be nothing more than 30 seconds of extra consciousness and the meaning you gave it. Sleep is not a switch, it is a tide, and it goes out and comes in all night long, and the shore is uncovered more often than anyone thinks. The mystery is not that you wake. The mystery is what you are supposed to do with it. There is a third rhythm worth knowing, because it is the one you can actually feel. Your core body temperature is not constant. It swings across the day by about a degree, and its lowest point falls in the small hours, typically an hour or two before your natural waking time. That drop is not incidental to sleep. It is part of how sleep works. Your body sheds heat through the skin of your hands and feet in order to lower the core, which is why warm feet help you fall asleep, and why a cool room helps more than a warm one. And at the bottom of that curve, in the coldest hour of your night, several things happen at once. Your alertness reaches its daily minimum, which is why the small hours are when hospital errors, industrial accidents, and single vehicle crashes peak, and why night shift workers describe a specific, dangerous heaviness at around 4. Your pain sensitivity tends to be higher. Your emotional regulation, the machinery that keeps a worry proportionate, is running on its lowest setting of the 24 hours. So the person you are at 3 in the morning is not the person you are at 3 in the afternoon, and this is not a figure of speech. It is a different chemical state, colder, less regulated, more permeable. That difference will matter enormously later tonight when we ask why thoughts at this hour feel the way they do. Hold the picture as it stands. A master clock of 20,000 cells above your optic nerves, setting the rhythm of every system you have. Melatonin peaking in the deep night. Cortisol reaching its floor and turning upward in the small hours, hours before you need it. Sleep pressure largely spent. Core temperature at its minimum. Deep sleep behind you. Light sleep and dreaming ahead. Core temperature at its minimum. Deep sleep behind you. Light sleep and dreaming ahead. That is the room you are awake in. Not a malfunction. Not a symptom. Not a failure of your machinery. A junction, arrived at on schedule, in a body doing precisely what it was built to do, and it is a room with a great many people in it. The hour has names in more languages than you would expect, and they carry the same freight everywhere. English called it the dead of night, and the small hours, and the witching hour. The Romans spoke of the fourth watch. Spanish has the madrugada, that stretch between deep night and dawn that is neither. Across cultures, folklore places the strange things at exactly this hour, the visitations, the thin places, the thresholds. Now the tempting move here is to say that all these traditions knew something occult about 3 in the morning, and that is not the claim being made, and I am not going to make it. The simpler explanation is better and more interesting. If human beings across every culture were reliably awake and alert in the small hours, in a chemical state that made them cold, ungoverned, and unusually susceptible, then of course that hour would accumulate stories. Of course it would become the time when the dead visit and the boundary thins. The folklore is not evidence of spirits. It is evidence that everyone was awake, everywhere, at the same hour, feeling roughly the same way. Which is exactly what the historical record, when someone finally went looking for it, turned out to say. And here is where the story turns from biology to something more uncomfortable, because for most of the last century, medicine treated that junction as a disease. If you had told a doctor in 1970 that you woke every night at 3 and lay awake for an hour, you would have been diagnosed with middle insomnia, sleep maintenance insomnia, and offered a sedative. The assumption underneath the diagnosis was so obvious that nobody thought to examine it, that human beings are built to sleep in one unbroken block of 7 or 8 hours, and that any interruption is a failure of the machinery. That assumption is what built the sleeping pill industry. Where did the 8 unbroken hours come from? Not from biology. No experiment ever established it as the natural human pattern. It came, as far as historians can trace it, from the factory. Industrial work required workers to arrive at a fixed hour, which required them to wake at a fixed hour, which required a night compressed into a single consolidated block that fit between the end of the shift and the start of the next one. Artificial lighting made the evening usable. Pushing bedtimes later, the whistle fixed the morning, and the night was squeezed from both ends until the ancient middle disappeared. Within a few generations, the compressed night was universal, and within a few more, it was assumed to be natural, and by the 20th century, it had become a medical standard against which people were diagnosed. This is how cultural arrangements become facts of nature, not by argument, but by the simple death of everyone who remembers otherwise. And that is the ordinary, unconspiratorial way real knowledge disappears. Nobody suppressed the older pattern, It simply stopped being practiced, then stopped being mentioned, then stopped being known. And the people who inherited the world it vanished from had no reason to suspect anything was missing. And it turns out to have been an assumption about culture, not about biology. And a historian working alone in an archive spent 16 years quietly demolishing it. Nobody was hiding anything. There was no conspiracy. The knowledge had simply been forgotten so thoroughly that even the people whose profession was sleep did not know it had ever existed. When the evidence finally surfaced, it did not come from a laboratory or a clinic. It came from court depositions, diaries, medical books, plays, and prayer manuals from the ordinary paper trail of ordinary lives in which people casually mentioned, without ever explaining, something they all did and nobody thought worth describing, the hour between their two sleeps. The historian is Roger Eckirk at Virginia Tech, and he was not looking for sleep at all. He was writing a history of night in the pre-industrial world, of what people did after dark, and the references kept surfacing in his sources until he could no longer treat them as noise. He eventually gathered over 2,000 of them in English, French, Italian, Latin, and other languages, spanning from antiquity through the 18th century, and published the finding in 2001, and then in a book that reframed the entire question. The phrases were consistent and unremarkable to their authors. First sleep, second sleep. In English, premier sommeil in French, primo sonno in Italian. Not a practice of monks or eccentrics, the ordinary night of ordinary people, described in passing, for centuries, by everyone. And before we go into that history, notice who else was awake at exactly this hour, on purpose, for over 1,000 years. In monasteries across Europe, the day was divided into fixed hours of prayer, and one of those offices fell in the dead of night. The monks called it vigils, or nocturnes, or matins, and it required them to rise in the darkness, often around 2 or 3 in the morning, walk to a cold church, and pray. This was not an occasional austerity, it was the ordinary shape of monastic life, practiced by hundreds of thousands of people across centuries, and the texts describing it treat the hour not as a hardship to be endured, but as a gift. They speak of the night watch as the time when the soul is least defended, and therefore most honest, when the noise of the world has stopped, and something can finally be heard. And here the break goes on, firmly, because this channel does not blur these lines. Monastic prayer is not evidence about circadian biology, and 1,000 years of vigils does not prove that your cortisol curve has a spiritual purpose. A structural parallel is not a proof, but it does raise a question that is worth carrying through the rest of this night. If waking in the small hours were purely pathological, purely a malfunction, it would be a strange thing for an entire civilization to have organized its most serious spiritual practice around it. They were not fighting the hour, they had built a room for it. Picture the practice as it actually was, because the detail matters more than the summary. A bell rings in the dark. There is no gentle transition, no slow waking. A man rises from a cold cell into a colder corridor and walks, half asleep, to a stone church lit by a few candles, and stands with others who have done the same, and they sing psalms in the middle of the night, while the rest of the world sleeps. Then, in many houses, they went back to bed and slept again until dawn. Read that sequence again, because it is the shape we will be following all night. A first sleep, an interval of wakefulness with something to do in it, and then a second sleep. The monasteries did not invent that shape. They took the shape human nights already had and put prayer into the gap, and they were explicit about why that gap was valuable. Their texts describe the night hours as the time when the usual defences are down, when a person cannot maintain the performance they maintain by day, when what is actually in the heart becomes visible because there is no energy left to hide it. Anyone who has lain awake at 3 and had a thought arrive with unbearable clarity knows exactly what those texts are describing. The monks did not consider that clarity a symptom. They considered it the point, and they organized 1,000 years of institutional life around being awake for it. And they were not alone in choosing this hour. The Hindu traditions of India named the stretch roughly an hour and a half before sunrise the Brahma Muhurta, the Creator's hour, and held it to be the most favorable time of the entire day for meditation and study, on the reasoning that the mind is clearest and the world quietest before dawn. Jewish practice preserves prayers for the night watches and a mystical tradition of rising at midnight to sit with the sorrow of the world. Islamic practice includes a voluntary night prayer performed in the last third of the night, valued precisely because it costs sleep and because that hour is considered closest. 4 traditions, with no shared theology, and in some cases no contact, independently identified the small hours as the time when a person is most available, and built practices to occupy them rather than medicate them. That convergence proves nothing about biology, and I am not offering it as proof. But it is a striking piece of testimony from people who spent their lives awake at exactly the hour you are awake now. And this is only the first thread, because everything you have heard so far, the clock in your head, the hormone that turns at 3, the monks in their cold church, is still just the shape of the hour. It does not yet explain the strangest fact in this entire story, which is that the pattern you experience as a problem was, until remarkably recently, the normal architecture of a human night. Not in the distant prehistoric past, in Europe, in England, in colonial America, within a few generations of people alive today, there was a first sleep and a second sleep, with a wakeful interval between them that people used for specific things, and the historical record describing it is enormous and was hiding in plain sight until one man went looking. And when a psychiatrist at the National Institutes of Health decided to test whether that pattern still lives inside modern bodies, and simply took away the artificial light, what happened to his volunteers was not what anyone expected. Consider what it would take to hide something that large. Not a document, not a discovery, but a habit practiced by every ordinary person across an entire civilization, mentioned casually in thousands of texts, and then simply forgotten so completely that by the 20th century no historian, no doctor, and no sleep scientist knew it had ever existed. That is what happened, and the reason it went unnoticed is almost funny. The references are everywhere, but they are always incidental. Nobody explains a thing everyone does. A character in a play mentions what he did between his sleeps, the way you might mention what you did after lunch, assuming no explanation is required. And 4 centuries later, a reader passes over the phrase without registering it, because the world it belonged to is gone. It took someone reading for 16 years with a specific question in mind to notice that the phrase kept appearing in depositions and diaries and prayer books and medical manuals across languages and centuries, always in the same casual register. First sleep, second sleep, and the hour between. Your 3 in the morning has a history. It also has an explanation, and it is not the one your doctor gave you. Stay with me. The appointment is older than you think. Your ancestors woke on purpose. You wake at 3 and think your body has failed you. They woke at the same hour and thought nothing at all, because in their world it was simply what a night was. They went to bed a few hours after dark, slept deeply, and then rose into the middle of your hour, as awake as you are, for an hour or 2, before lying down to sleep again until dawn. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a guess about prehistoric people nobody can check. It is documented in over 2,000 references across 5 centuries, gathered by the historian Roger Kirk at Virginia Tech. Depositions, diaries, medical texts, poems, prayer manuals, in English, French, Italian, and Latin, always in the same casual tone. Because everyone did it, and nobody thought it needed explaining. They even had names for the two halves of your night: first sleep and second sleep. In French, premier sommeil; in Italian, primo sonno; in Latin, concubia nocta, and the hours after. The vocabulary existed in every language of the region, which is what you would expect for a universal experience, and not at all what you would expect for a local custom. And the hour you are lying in right now, the one you have been taught to fear, was so ordinary to them that a witness in a criminal case could date an evening's events by it, the way you might say after lunch. The texture of the references is what convinces, more than the number. A physician's manual advising on the best position for sleeping mentions, in passing, what to do after the first sleep. A conduct book instructs young people on how to spend the waking interval piously. Court testimony records that a neighbour heard a disturbance between the first and second sleep. Chaucer, writing in the 14th century, has a character go back to bed after the first sleep and expects no explanation. A French medical text discusses which activities are appropriate to the interval. None of these authors is describing an unusual custom. Each is making an offhand reference to a shared reality, which is exactly what makes the evidence strong. A conspiracy can forge a document. Nobody can forge the incidental grammar of an entire civilization in 5 languages across 500 years. The strangest part is not that they did it. The strangest part is how completely we forgot. By the middle of the 20th century, no historian knew this, no physician knew it, and no sleep scientist knew it. The references had not been destroyed or suppressed. They were sitting in libraries, in plain sight, in books people read all the time. But a phrase only registers if you have a category for it, and the category was gone, so readers slid over first sleep for 200 years without seeing anything, the way your eye slides over a word in a language you do not speak. It took a man reading with that specific question in mind for 16 years to notice that the phrase kept coming back. And what he found does not merely change our picture of the past, it changes the diagnosis on tens of millions of people who are lying awake tonight, being told by their own culture that their bodies are broken. There is a particular way that knowledge dies, and it is worth understanding because it explains how something this large could vanish without anyone noticing. Facts do not usually get destroyed, they get orphaned. A practice stops, and for a generation the memory of it survives in the people who used to do it, and then those people die, and what remains is only the paper. And the paper is written in a code that assumed a reader who already knew. Consider how you would describe your own evening in a diary. You would not explain what a television is, or why you eat at 7, because you assume anyone reading shares the world. 400 years from now, a historian would need to reconstruct that world before your sentences meant anything. That is precisely what happened here, and it is worth noticing how recently the recovery occurred. The historical work appeared in 2001, and the book that made it widely known came in 2005, which means that for the entire 20th century, every physician who diagnosed middle-of-the-night waking, every pharmaceutical company that marketed a sedative for it, and every patient who worried they were broken was operating without a piece of information that changes the interpretation of the whole phenomenon. Not because anyone lied, because the knowledge had gone quiet, and nobody thought to ask the archives a question that only a historian would think to ask. The people writing about their first sleep never once defined the term, because defining it would have been as strange as defining breakfast. And so the phrase sat in thousands of documents, perfectly preserved and perfectly invisible, for 2 centuries, until someone arrived with the right question. This is not a story about a discovery, it is a story about a recovery, and the difference matters because it means the thing recovered was never anywhere else. It was in us the whole time, in the bodies of everyone reading, waiting under the streetlight glow for a night long enough to reveal it. So what did they do in that hour The records are surprisingly specific, and the answer is everything ordinary. Quietly, they tended the fire. They checked on animals. They mended things, quietly, by whatever light there was. They prayed, and the surviving prayer manuals include prayers written specifically for that waking, which tells you it was expected. They talked. They visited neighbours occasionally, which the authorities disliked. Couples used the interval, and a French physician of the period recommended it for conception on the grounds that people had rested and had more energy than at bedtime, which is a detail that has a way of making the whole thing suddenly concrete. That single sentence does more work than any statistic, because it is the kind of thing nobody invents. A doctor giving practical advice to ordinary couples, assuming a waking interval as the unremarkable background of married life, in a manual meant to be useful. You cannot fake that register. It is the sound of a world describing itself without knowing anyone is listening, and it is the reason historians trust incidental evidence more than deliberate testimony. And, most interestingly for our purposes, they lay in the dark and thought. Kirk found that people used the interval to reflect on their dreams, which were fresh, since they had just risen from the dream-rich half of the night, and the record is full of the sense that this was a time of unusual introspection. That detail about dreams deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it connects two things that modern life has separated. The second half of the night is when dreaming is densest. The long REM periods cluster there. In the hours before dawn, a person who wakes in the middle of the night rises directly out of that dense dreaming, with the material still warm, before the ordinary erasure has done its work. And in a pre-industrial world, dreams were not considered noise. They were taken seriously as messages, warnings, and guidance in nearly every culture on record. So the traditional night contained a structural feature we have entirely lost. A built-in period of quiet wakefulness, positioned exactly where dream memory is richest, in which a person could lie in the dark and consider what they had just been shown. We wake to an alarm at the end of the night and lose our dreams within 90 seconds, in a rush toward the day. They woke in the middle of the night with nothing to do and nowhere to be, and had an hour to sit with it. Whatever you believe dreams are, an hour of undisturbed reflection on your own mind's productions, every night of your life, is not a small thing to have lost, not an ordeal, not a symptom. An hour that belonged to no one else, in a life where privacy was almost impossible to come by, and where a person could finally be alone with their own mind. Think about what privacy meant in that world, because it makes the interval more precious rather than less. Whole families slept in one room, often in one bed, along with servants and sometimes animals. There was no space in a day that was yours. You were watched from waking to sleeping, by household, by neighbours, by a village that knew everything. And then, in the middle of the night, everyone else was unconscious. The fire had burned down. The room was dark and the world was silent, and for 1 or 2 hours a person had something that their waking life could not provide at all: solitude, in the middle of their own house, with no one asking anything of them. It is not surprising that the records associate the interval with reflection and prayer and intimacy. Those are the things people do when finally unobserved, and it may explain something about why the hour feels the way it does to you now, which is that solitude of that depth is still what it delivers, except that you have not been taught to want it. You have been taught that the hour is stolen from you. To them, it was the only hour of the day that nobody could take. Then it vanished, and the timing of the vanishing tells you the cause. The references thin out through the 18th century and are largely gone by the end of the 19th. What changed in that window was light. Street lighting arrived in European cities and then spread. The gas lamp, then the electric bulb, pushed the usable evening later and later, and as bedtime moved forward, the night compressed. Add the factory, which required workers to present themselves at a fixed hour regardless of the sun, and the compression came from both ends. The night that had been 10 or 11 hours long with room for a gap in the middle, became a squeezed 7 or 8, and the gap had nowhere left to sit. Within a few generations, sleeping straight through became normal. Within a few more, it became natural, and by the 20th century, waking in the middle of the night had become a disorder with a name and a prescription. The speed of the change is worth pausing on, because it is the fastest environmental transformation our species has ever undergone in a domain this fundamental. For roughly 200,000 years, the light available to a human being after sunset was firelight and moonlight, warm, dim, flickering, and useless for most tasks. Then, in the space of about a century and a half, we filled the night with gas lamps, then filament bulbs, then fluorescent tubes, then screens held 30 centimeters from the face, and emitting exactly the wavelengths the circadian clock is most sensitive to. The change from a candlelit evening to a lit one is not a difference of degree. A single modern room at night can be dozens of times brighter than anything our ancestors experienced after dark. And the clock in your head, the one built over hundreds of millions of years to read light, as the single reliable signal of where you are in the day, has no way to know that the sun has not simply stayed up. It responds the only way it can. It pushes the whole schedule later. Your melatonin release is delayed. Your bedtime moves. Your night is compressed at one end while your alarm compresses it at the other, and the ancient interval is squeezed out of a night that no longer has the room. The physicians naming the remnant a disorder had no idea they were pathologizing the human night as it had been lived for most of recorded history. Which leaves the question that makes all of this more than a historical curiosity. Is that pattern still in us? History tells you what people did. It does not tell you whether their bodies were doing something ours no longer do. And in the early 1990s, a psychiatrist named Thomas Weir at the National Institute of Mental Health ran the experiment that answers it. Though he was not looking for medieval sleep at all, he was interested in what happens to human beings under natural light conditions, in the long nights our species evolved under, before artificial lighting extended our days. So he took a group of healthy volunteers and gave them 14 hours of darkness every night for several weeks. No lamps, no screens, no reading, just darkness. For 14 hours, the way a winter night would have been for most of human history. And then he measured what their bodies did with it. Imagine volunteering for that. You arrive at the laboratory in the evening and are shown to a room, and at a certain hour the lights go off and they stay off for 14 hours. There is nothing to do. No book, because you cannot see it. No phone, because it is 1992 and there are none. And anyway, that is the entire point. You cannot leave. There is nothing but a bed and darkness, and however many hours the body decides to fill. Modern people dropped into a pre-industrial winter night with no way to escape it. Almost nobody alive has had this experience. Even camping does not replicate it. Because we bring lights. Consider how strange that is. There is a condition that every single human being experienced every winter night for 200,000 years, and it is now so rare that producing it requires a laboratory and a research grant. We have not merely changed our habits, we have made an ancestral environment experimentally inaccessible, and then measured ourselves against a standard drawn entirely from the artificial one. And the first thing that happened was simply that they slept, and slept, and slept, 11 hours a night at first, for weeks, which told Ware something uncomfortable about the population they had been drawn from. These were ordinary healthy adults who considered themselves well rested, and their bodies, given permission, took an extra 3 or 4 hours a night for weeks before levelling off. The sleep debt of modern life is not an abstraction. It is the thing that had to be paid down before the experiment could begin. For the first few weeks, they slept enormously, catching up on what turned out to be a substantial hidden sleep debt. But once that had cleared, something else emerged, and it was not what anyone had predicted. Their sleep settled into a stable pattern of roughly 4 hours, followed by an interval of 1 to 3 hours of quiet wakefulness, followed by another 4 hours of sleep. 2 sleeps, with a gap in the middle. Not a shorter night, not a broken night. A night with a different architecture entirely. One that no modern person had described, because no modern person had been given the conditions to produce it. Nobody instructed them to do this. Nobody had told them about first sleep and second sleep. At the time, the historical work had not even been published. Their bodies, given a long night and no artificial light, simply reorganized into the pattern that the archives say human beings kept for centuries. Nothing was taught, nothing was suggested. The darkness was extended, and the old shape came back. The pattern was not a cultural habit that people had learned. It was sitting inside modern bodies, dormant under electric light, waiting for a long enough night. And notice the order in which the 2 halves of this story arrived, because it is what makes them worth trusting. Ware published his findings in the early 1990s. Eckert published the historical work in 2001. Neither was aware of the other while doing it. A psychiatrist measuring hormones in a Maryland laboratory, and a historian reading court records in a Virginia library. Working on completely unrelated questions, with no shared assumptions, and no possibility of influencing each other, arrived at the same structure: a first sleep, an interval of quiet wakefulness, a second sleep. When Eckert eventually learned of the experiment, and Ware of the archives, each provided the other with exactly what their own method could not supply. History cannot tell you what a body does. Physiology cannot tell you what people did. Neither, alone, would have been believed. Together they describe the same night from 2 directions, and that convergence is far stronger evidence than either would be alone. This is what a real finding looks like: independent methods, aimed at different questions, colliding. And now the detail that reframes this entire night, the one that is almost never mentioned when this research is summarized. Ware's team did not just record when the volunteers were awake. They measured what was happening in their blood during that interval, and what they found was a state that does not exist in modern life. During the waking gap, the volunteers' levels of prolactin, a hormone associated with states of calm quiescence, remained elevated, at levels normally seen during sleep. Their melatonin remained high. Physiologically, they were not awake in the way you are awake at your desk, and they were not asleep. They were in a third state, a kind of restful, meditative wakefulness. And the volunteers described it in terms Ware found striking: a quiet, non-anxious, almost floating condition, unlike anything in their ordinary lives. Ware himself suggested that this state might resemble what meditative practices attempt to produce deliberately, and that modern people, by compressing their nights, may have lost routine access to a mode of consciousness that our ancestors entered every single night without effort. He went further, in a direction that is rarely quoted. He noted that this nightly interval of hormonally supported, non-anxious wakefulness sat directly adjacent to the richest dreaming of the night, and wondered aloud whether the loss of it might have consequences for how modern people relate to their own inner lives, cutting them off from a channel that earlier humans had open every night. That is speculation, and he presented it as speculation, and it should be held as such. But it is speculation by the man who ran the experiment, about the state he measured, and it is worth more than most people's certainties. Read that again. Not lost a habit, not lost an hour, lost a state of mind, one the body produces on its own, given a long enough darkness, and one which practically no one alive in an industrialized country now experiences. Consider what our culture does instead. We have an entire industry devoted to teaching people to reach a calm, non-anxious, quietly aware state of mind. Apps, retreats, courses, books, all pointed at producing a condition of restful alertness that is difficult for most people to reach and requires years of practice to sustain. And here is a laboratory finding suggesting that the human body enters something in that neighborhood spontaneously, every night, for free, provided the night is long enough and dark enough. We have not lost the capacity. We have covered it with light at both ends. The gap where it used to live still opens in many of us at the appointed hour, and we spend it doing the one thing guaranteed to destroy the state, lying rigid in the dark, calculating how many hours remain before the alarm, and generating exactly the arousal that ends any possibility of quiet. The room is still there. We have just filled it with panic, and the panic has a source that is worth naming, because it is not personal failure, it is arithmetic. You wake at 3 and immediately the calculation begins. 4 hours left, and I need 7, and I have a meeting, and if I do not sleep now, I will be useless. That calculation is a product of a life organized around a fixed morning. And your ancestors did not have it. Nobody was measuring their sleep against a standard, because there was no standard and no clock in the room and no alarm to fail. They woke, and the night was long, and there was more of it, and the question of whether they were getting enough simply did not arise. The clock is the thing that turned a neutral hour into an ordeal, not the light, not the factory, not the hormone. The clock on the nightstand, telling you exactly how much you are losing, minute by minute, all night long. So hold the whole structure. 2,000 references across 5 centuries describing a first sleep and a second sleep, with an ordinary waking hour between them. The disappearance of that pattern tracking exactly with the arrival of artificial light and the factory clock. The medical profession, a century later, naming the remnant of it a disorder. A psychiatrist at the National Institute of Mental Health giving modern volunteers 14 hours of darkness and watching their sleep split, unprompted, into the archival pattern. And in that gap, a hormonal signature that is neither waking nor sleep, described by the people in it as calm, floating, and unlike anything they knew. That is the state you may be sitting in right now, at this very hour, in the dark, with the video playing, without knowing it has a name, believing it is a symptom. And there is a practical consequence that follows immediately, before we even get to the objections. If the interval is a normal feature of a long night, rather than a failure of a short one, then the correct response to it is not the one you have been using. Lying rigid, eyes shut, willing yourself back to sleep, calculating the shrinking hours, is a strategy that fights the hour and reliably loses, because the effort itself produces arousal. And arousal is the one thing guaranteed to keep you awake. The sleep clinics know this. It is why one of the most effective treatments for insomnia involves getting out of bed rather than staying in it, breaking the association between the bed and the struggle. The historical record suggests something even simpler, which our ancestors did without needing a clinic. They got up, did something quiet and undemanding in the dark, and went back to bed when sleep returned, without ever once wondering whether something was wrong with them. The difference between their hour and your hour is not physiological. It is that they were not afraid of it. Now the break, hard, because this is the point where a careless telling becomes a false one. The Ware study was small, a few dozen participants at most, in a laboratory, under conditions no one lives in. 14 hours of enforced darkness is not the same as a candlelit farmhouse, and it is certainly not the same as your bedroom tonight. Some sleep researchers argue that the pattern he produced is an artifact of an unnaturally long night rather than a recovery of an ancestral rhythm. And they note that studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, whose lives are the closest available model for ancestral conditions, have generally found consolidated sleep rather than segmented sleep, though with less total sleep than we assume, and with wakings that go unremarked. That is a serious objection, and it must be carried honestly through the rest of tonight. The historical record is strong for pre-industrial Europe. The universality of the pattern across all human societies is not established. What the evidence supports is narrower and still remarkable. Let us be precise about what the strongest objection does and does not reach, because precision here is worth more than enthusiasm. It does reach the claim that segmented sleep is the one true human pattern encoded in our species from which industrial life has exiled us. That claim overreaches, and you will hear it made confidently in a great many places, and you should not accept it, including from me. What the objection does not reach is anything that matters for the person lying awake. It does not touch the historical record, which is enormous and unambiguous for pre-industrial Europe. It does not touch Ware's finding that modern bodies, in long darkness, split their sleep. It does not touch the hormonal measurements taken during that split. And it does not touch the central practical conclusion, which stands regardless of how the anthropological argument resolves, that there is no experimental basis for treating a night of unbroken sleep as the biological standard of health, and therefore no basis for the alarm you feel when your own night fails to match it. Segmented sleep is a genuine and well-documented human pattern under certain conditions. Modern bodies can still fall into it, and the 8-hour block you are measuring yourself against was never established by anyone. And notice what the traditions did with that gap, because it confirms the shape of the history from an entirely independent direction. If the archives are right, that pre-industrial nights contained a waking interval, then any religious practice that fixed prayer in the middle of the night was not asking people to sacrifice sleep. It was occupying a space that was already open. The monastic office of vigils, sung across Europe for over 1,000 years, falls precisely in that window. The Hindu tradition's Brahma Muhurta, the hour and a half before dawn held to be the finest time of the day for contemplation, sits at the far end of it. Jewish mystical practice developed a midnight vigil, a sitting with the world's sorrow in the deepest part of the night. The voluntary night prayer of Islamic practice belongs to the last third of the night, and its value is understood to lie partly in the stillness of that hour. 4 traditions, largely independent, each identifying the same stretch of the night as the time when a person is most available, and each building something to put in it. They were not fighting the body, they were furnishing a room the body had already opened, and what they put in the room is revealing. The night office was not built around cheerful material. Its core is the Psalms, and the Psalms sung at that hour tend toward the ones about darkness, waiting, abandonment, and the long stretch before dawn. There is a line, sung for centuries in the middle of the night, by people who were awake because their bodies had woken them, about the soul waiting for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning. That is not an abstraction to anyone who has lain awake at 3. The watchmen were real, standing on real walls, counting the hours, and the person singing had been asleep and was now awake in the coldest part of the night, waiting, exactly as the psalm described. The tradition matched the material to the hour. It did not offer the wakeful person distraction, or reassurance, or a technique for getting back to sleep. It offered them language for the specific quality of that hour, the waiting, the exposure, the sense that something is being endured that will end at dawn, and it offered company, which may matter more. A monk waking at that hour did not wake alone. He walked into a room where 40 other people had also been woken, all of them cold, all of them half asleep, all of them doing the same thing. The hour that feels most isolating in modern life was, in that arrangement, the hour of maximum company. Whatever else the practice accomplished, it took the loneliest stretch of the night and filled it with other human beings. Which is a solution so obvious that it took a 1,000-year-old institution to think of it, and which no amount of sleep hygiene advice will ever replicate. Whatever you make of the theology, that is sophisticated psychological engineering. Give a person in a difficult state words that name the state precisely, and the state becomes bearable. Because it has been mapped by someone who was there before you. The break stays on. Convergence between traditions is not evidence about physiology. and none of those practices were derived from any understanding of hormones. A structural parallel is not a proof, but there is something the parallel legitimately shows, which is that the gap was universally regarded as useful rather than pathological, and that the way you experience it tonight, as an ordeal to be ended as quickly as possible, is a modern invention with a traceable birth date. Which brings us to the question that will occupy the rest of this night, and it is the one that actually matters to you, lying there. Because knowing the history does not automatically change the hour. You can know everything in this video and still wake at 3 with your heart going and your mind reaching for the worst available thought. So why is that? Why does the mind at this hour work so differently, arriving at conclusions it would never accept in daylight? Treating a manageable worry as a catastrophe with complete conviction? There is a specific neurological answer, and it is one of the most useful things anyone can learn about their own head. The hour is not lying to you at random. It is lying to you in a particular, predictable direction, and once you know the direction, you can correct for it. Everyone knows the experience, even if they have never named it. A problem that seemed manageable at 10 in the evening becomes, at 3, an unanswerable catastrophe. A remark someone made at work becomes evidence of something enormous. A physical sensation becomes a diagnosis. And then, in the morning, over coffee, in ordinary light, the same problem is merely a problem again. And you cannot reconstruct how it felt 4 hours earlier, and you think, what was that? That was not a mood. It was a measurable neurological state, and it has a shape. And the shape is consistent enough across human beings that it can be described in advance. There is a reason the thoughts that arrive at that hour are always the darkest available. There is a reason they feel true rather than merely plausible. And there is a reason that a person who understands the mechanism can stand somewhere slightly outside it, even while it is happening, and let it pass rather than following it down. That is where we go next. Your mind is lying to you right now. Whatever you are worrying about at this hour, your assessment of it is wrong, and wrong in a specific, measurable, entirely predictable direction. This is not a metaphor, and it is not reassurance. Your brain at 3 in the morning is running in a different chemical configuration than your brain at 3 in the afternoon, and researchers have mapped enough of the difference to say what it does to your thinking. It dims the machinery that keeps your worries proportionate. It amplifies the machinery that detects threat, and it removes nearly every correction daylight provides. You are not seeing your life clearly at this hour, not more honestly, not with the illusions finally stripped away. You are reading it off an instrument that has been biologically detuned. Everyone knows this from the inside, even if nobody has ever named it. A problem that was manageable at 10 in the evening becomes, at 3, an unanswerable catastrophe. A remark a colleague made becomes evidence of something enormous. A pain in your side becomes a diagnosis. A decision you made years ago becomes the ruin of your life. And then morning comes, and you drink coffee in ordinary light, and the same problem is merely a problem again, and you cannot reconstruct how it felt 4 hours earlier. You think, what was that? That was not a mood, and it was not weakness, and it was not the truth finally surfacing. It was a state with a mechanism, measurable in a scanner and predictable from a clock, and that mechanism is one of the most useful things a person can learn about their own head, because once you know which way the instrument is bent, you can read around the error even while it is happening. And there is a test you can run on yourself tonight that demonstrates this better than any study. Take whatever thought is currently occupying you and ask a single question. Have I ever, at any point in daylight, believed this with anything like the same intensity? Nearly always the answer is no. The worry exists in the day, but as a manageable item on a list, something to be handled Thursday. At 3 in the morning, the same content arrives, wearing entirely different clothes. Total, urgent, unanswerable, and dressed as a revelation. Notice that the facts have not changed between those two states. Nothing about your finances or your health or your relationship altered between 10 in the evening and 3 in the morning. Only the reader changed. When the same data produces wildly different readings depending on the time of day, you are not learning about the data. You are learning about the instrument. So here is what the next stretch will do. First, the mechanism. What actually changes in the brain in the small hours? Which regions go quiet? Which go loud? And why the specific flavor of 3 in the morning thinking is always the same flavor for everybody. Second, the paradox at the center of the hour, which is that the same state that makes your worries unbearable is also, in a form the traditions understood better than we do, the state in which people have always reported seeing themselves most clearly. And third, what to do with the hour, practically, tonight, in terms specific enough to use, drawn from the sleep clinics and from 1,000 years of people who woke at this hour deliberately and needed something to do with it. Start with the machinery. The part of your brain that keeps your thinking proportionate lies behind your forehead, in the prefrontal cortex. And among its many jobs is the regulation of the emotional centers beneath it. When something frightening or upsetting arises, a structure called the amygdala, deep in the temporal lobe, generates the alarm, and the prefrontal cortex evaluates it. Is this actually dangerous? Is it happening now? Is this proportionate? What can be done? That evaluation is what turns raw fear into a manageable concern. It is the difference between a thought about your finances and a conviction that you are ruined. And the prefrontal cortex is the most expensive, most fragile, most recently evolved part of your brain, and it is the first thing to go offline when the brain is tired. Think of it as the difference between a smoke alarm and a person. The alarm's job is to be loud and early and stupid. It does not distinguish between a house fire and burnt toast, and it should not, because the cost of missing a fire is catastrophic, and the cost of a false alarm is annoyance. That is your amygdala, and it has been doing that job successfully for hundreds of millions of years. The person's job is to walk into the kitchen, look, and say, "It is toast, we are fine, open a window." That is your prefrontal cortex, and it is the thing that arrived recently, costs enormous energy, and shuts down first under strain. Now picture a house in which the alarm is working perfectly and nobody is home to check the kitchen. That is your head at 3 in the morning. The alarm is not malfunctioning, it is doing exactly what it always does. What is missing is the person who walks in and looks. And because the alarm cannot tell you that nobody checked, its shriek arrives feeling like information about the world rather than a fact about the hour. The evidence for this is not speculative. Studies of sleep deprivation, including well-known work by Matthew Walker and colleagues at the University of California, have imaged the sleep-deprived brain during emotional tasks and found two things happening at once. The amygdala becomes markedly more reactive to negative material, in some studies by a very large margin, and the functional connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala weakens, meaning the alarm rings louder, while the part that would evaluate the alarm is less able to reach it. That is not a subtle shift in mood. It is a structural change in the relationship between your fear system and your judgment, and it is exactly what you would engineer if you wanted to build a mind that catastrophizes. And note that this is measured after sleep deprivation, whereas at 3 in the morning, you are not deprived, you are simply in the low point of the circadian cycle. With your body temperature at its minimum, and your brain in the least favorable configuration of the 24 hours for careful thought, there is a second, quieter distortion working alongside it, and it is called mood-congruent memory, and it is one of the best established findings in cognitive psychology. Your memory is not a filing cabinet from which you retrieve items at random. It is biased toward whatever matches your current emotional state, which means that when you feel bleak, the memories that arrive most easily are the bleak ones. In a low state, your entire past reorganizes itself. The failures come forward, the humiliations surface with unusual clarity, and the evidence that your life has been reasonable becomes strangely difficult to access. This is why 3 a.m. so often involves a review of everything you have ever done wrong, in chronological order. It is not that the night has granted you an honest audit. It is that the retrieval system is being queried by a distressed mind, and it is returning matching results, exactly as it is designed to do. Then those retrieved failures become evidence for the catastrophic conclusion, which deepens the mood, which biases retrieval further. The loop is self-feeding, and it runs at that hour without any external input at all, which explains something that ought to be strange, but that nobody remarks on: the remarkable sameness of 3 a.m, thinking across entirely different people. Ask anyone what they think about when they wake in the small hours, and the categories are nearly always the same: money, health, death, a relationship. Something shameful from the past. A decision that cannot be undone, not the mildly interesting, not the merely pending, not the problem you are actually going to have to solve on Tuesday. Always the deepest available threat, in a room with no light. Nobody wakes at 3 and thinks carefully about a mildly interesting logistical problem at work. The mind goes directly to the deepest available threat, every time, because the machinery that would normally rank threats by their actual urgency is not fully operating. And what remains is a system that simply retrieves whatever is most emotionally charged. It is not that your problems become larger at night. It is that the sorting mechanism goes offline, and what is left is a pile with the heaviest thing on top. And there may be a reason the pile is arranged that way, which makes the hour less personal and easier to bear. For almost all of our species' history, the night was genuinely dangerous. A human alone in the dark, in a world containing predators and hostile groups and no fire, was in real jeopardy, and a nervous system that became more vigilant and more threat-focused in darkness would have kept its owner alive. The bias toward the worst available interpretation is not a design flaw. It is an inheritance from ancestors for whom the worst available interpretation was frequently correct after sundown. What has changed is the content. Your ancestors woke at 3 and scanned for movement at the edge of the firelight, and the vigilance was useful because there was something to scan for. You wake at 3 in a locked house in a safe street, and the same vigilance system switches on and finds nothing to scan, so it turns inward and scans your life instead. The machinery is doing precisely what it evolved to do. It simply has nothing appropriate left to point at, and so it points at your mortgage, your marriage, and your body. There is a second feature, and it is the one that makes the hour so convincing. In daylight, an alarming thought arrives alongside its context. You can see the room. Other people are talking. Tasks are pending. The world is providing constant evidence that life is ongoing and various. At 3 a.m, there is no context at all. There is a dark room, a still body, and a single thought, with nothing whatsoever to compare it against. Attention has nowhere else to go, and a thought that occupies your entire field of awareness feels much larger than the same thought glanced at in a busy afternoon. Add to that the absence of any possibility of action. You cannot call anyone. You cannot check anything. You cannot do the one thing that reliably reduces anxiety, which is to take a step towards solving the problem. So the mind circles, and each circuit deepens the groove, and there is nothing to interrupt it. That is the machinery of 3 a.m, an amplified alarm, a weakened evaluator, a total absence of context, and no available action. Any mind put in that configuration will produce catastrophe. Yours is not defective. It is simply obeying the physics of the hour. There is one more ingredient, and it is the one people are least willing to name. You are alone, not metaphorically. At 3 a.m, everyone you could reach is unconscious, and the social world that normally holds a person's sense of proportion has switched off. A worry survives contact with another human being very poorly. Say it aloud to someone at noon, and it usually shrinks in the saying, because their face tells you something about its actual size. At 3 a.m. there is no face. There is no reality check available from any direction, and the mind, deprived of the correction that other people constantly and unknowingly provide, runs open loop. This is why the hour feels so particularly bleak to people who live alone, and why even those who do not live alone experience it that way, since the person beside them is asleep and cannot be woken for something so vague. Whatever else the night is doing, it is removing every mechanism by which a human being ordinarily stays sane, and then asking you to evaluate your life. So hold it plainly, because this is the sentence to remember the next time you are lying there. At 3 a.m, your fear system is running hot, your judgment system is running cold, your body temperature is at its lowest, your context is zero, and action is impossible. Every thought produced under those conditions is systematically biased toward the catastrophic. The thought is not a revelation. It is a reading taken from an instrument you know to be miscalibrated in the 1 hour of the day when it is guaranteed to be miscalibrated in exactly that direction. That sentence is worth memorizing because it can be deployed in the moment, and deployment is the whole point. The trouble with knowing about a cognitive distortion is that the distortion does not feel like a distortion from the inside. It feels like clarity. Nobody at 3 a.m. thinks I am currently catastrophizing. They think I have finally seen the situation for what it is, and the seeing feels sharper and more honest than daylight thinking, which is exactly the signature of the state. So the countermeasure cannot be a feeling. Feelings are compromised. It has to be a rule, held in advance, applied regardless of how convincing the content is. The rule is, no conclusions at this hour. Not about your marriage, not about your job, not about whether your life has been wasted. The thought may return in the morning, and if it does, it deserves a hearing then, in daylight, in a body that is warm and rested and capable of evaluating it. If it does not return, you have learned what it was. And now the paradox, because if that were the whole story, this would be a simple video with a simple lesson, and the hour would deserve nothing but suspicion. But there is another side, and every tradition that took the night seriously insisted on it. And a great many artists and writers have reported it independently. The same stripping away that makes your worries unbearable also removes the defenses that keep you from seeing certain things at all. In daylight, the prefrontal machinery that keeps your fears proportionate also keeps your self-image intact. It manages, edits, rationalizes, and maintains the story in which you are basically fine. That management costs energy, and at 3 a.m. the energy is gone, which means the hour tells you two kinds of things, and they are genuinely different in kind, and learning to tell them apart may be the most valuable skill available here. It tells you catastrophic falsehoods about the future, which are artifacts of the state, and it sometimes tells you plain truths about the present that you have been managing not to notice, which are not artifacts at all. You can distinguish them, and the traditions figured out how. A catastrophic falsehood is about the future, is enormous, is vague, and demands immediate action it makes impossible. I am going to lose everything. I am dying. My life has been wasted. A 3 a.m. truth is usually about the present, is specific, is small, and is uncomfortable rather than terrifying. I have not spoken to my brother in 2 years, and I am the one who should call. I have known for months that this job is finished. I am drinking more than I want to admit. Notice the difference in texture. The falsehood is a storm. The truth is a quiet sentence you have been out running during business hours, which finally catches you when you stop moving. And there is a second diagnostic, equally usable in the dark. Ask what the thought wants from you. The catastrophic thought demands that you do something immediately about a thing that cannot be done at all at this hour. which is why it produces the peculiar torment of urgent helplessness. The true thought does not demand anything tonight. It simply sits there, having been said at last, and can be carried to the morning without damage. So if what you are experiencing is a shrieking imperative to act on something you cannot act on until 9, you are in the falsehood, reliably, every time. And if what you are experiencing is an uncomfortable sentence that has been waiting a long time to be heard and asks only to be acknowledged, that one you may want to write down, because the daylight self is very skilled at losing it again by breakfast. The desert monastics had a precise instruction about exactly this, and it survives in the monastic literature. Distrust the thought that arrives with urgency and grandeur. Attend to the one that arrives quietly and will still be there in the morning. That test is available to anyone tonight, requires no belief, and costs nothing. And the second category deserves respect rather than dismissal, which is where a purely medical account of this hour goes wrong. If we treat every 3 in the morning thought as a symptom to be medicated away, we lose something genuinely valuable, because there are things a person can only hear when the management stops. The daylight self is busy, and being busy is one of the most effective ways of not knowing something. You can go years without registering that a relationship ended some time ago, or that you have been afraid of the same thing since childhood, or that the work you are doing is not the work you wanted to do. And the going years without registering is not accidental. It is a skill, maintained at some cost, by exactly the machinery that goes quiet at 3. So the hour opens a door that daylight keeps shut. What comes through it is mostly noise and catastrophe, and one must learn to discount that heavily. But not everything that comes through is noise, and a person who learns to sit in that hour without panicking sometimes receives, once or twice in a life, a sentence they needed and had been arranging not to hear. The traditions did not consider that a side effect. They considered it the reason to be awake. This is also why the hour has such a long association with clarity and creation, which sits oddly beside its reputation for dread. Writers and composers across centuries have described working in the small hours, and the reason is not romance. It is the same neurology, seen from the other side. The prefrontal machinery that keeps your thoughts orderly also keeps them conventional. It is the part that rejects the strange connection before it is finished forming. Turn it down, and associations move more freely, which is a disaster for evaluating your finances, and an advantage for finding an image nobody has found before. It is the same loosening either way. Point it at your bank balance and you get ruin. Point it at a problem you have been circling for weeks and you sometimes get the answer, arriving sideways, from a direction daylight thinking would have refused to consider. The state that produces catastrophe in one context produces unexpected connection in another, and it is the same state. Being fed different material. The examples are everywhere once you look. Writers who work in the small hours, composers who report that the material comes when the house is quiet, mathematicians who describe solutions arriving after a night of half-waking. And the connection to dreaming is not coincidental, because the state we are describing sits directly adjacent to it. You have risen out of the dream-dense half of the night into a mind whose ordinary censorship is at its lowest ebb, with the associative machinery still running warm. That is a genuinely unusual cognitive condition, and it is available to almost everyone, several nights a week, for free. We do not use it, because we have been trained to regard being awake at that hour as an emergency, and an emergency is not a state in which anyone makes anything. There is a real irony here. The most creatively permissive hour of the 24, the one our ancestors used for reflection and our artists have quietly exploited for centuries, has been rebranded in modern life as a symptom, and millions of people spend it rigid with anxiety about not sleeping, which suggests something practical. The hour is not good or bad. It is unguarded. What it does to you depends almost entirely on what you point it at, and the one thing guaranteed to point it badly is lying still in the dark, with nothing to attend to except your own life, which yields the most practical instruction available tonight, and it comes from the sleep clinics rather than from any tradition, though the traditions arrived at it first. If you are awake for more than about 20 minutes, and the wakefulness has become effortful, get out of the bed. This is a core element of the standard behavioral treatment for insomnia, and its logic is precise. The bed must remain associated with sleep, and every hour spent lying in it awake and frustrated trains your nervous system to treat lying down as the beginning of a struggle. So leave, go to another room, keep the light low, and do something undemanding and finite, and return when you feel sleepy rather than when you feel you ought to. Do not check the time. This one instruction does more than any other, because the clock is what converts an hour of wakefulness into an hour of loss. Nobody lies awake, calculating in a world without numbers on the nightstand. The moment you read 3:40, you are no longer simply awake, you are behind, and being behind produces exactly the arousal that guarantees you will still be awake at 4:20 to confirm it. Turn the clock around. This costs nothing, and is the closest thing to a free improvement available in this entire subject. Do not open anything with a screen and a feed, because the two features of a feed are bright light and endless novelty, and both are precisely engineered to end sleep. And do not, above all, use the hour to solve your life, because the instrument is detuned, and any conclusion you reach will have to be re-reached in the morning anyway. That is the whole protocol. It is not complicated, and its difficulty lies entirely in the willingness to stop fighting. And this is precisely, exactly, what the traditions built their night practices to solve, which is more sophisticated than it first appears. Consider what a monastic night office actually does to a person in that state. It gets them out of the bed, which breaks the association between lying down and lying awake, and this alone is the single most effective element of modern insomnia treatment. It gives the unguarded mind a fixed external object to attend to, so that attention has somewhere to go other than inward. The object is language rather than silence, and specifically language that names difficulty rather than denying it, which prevents the mind from feeling alone in its distress. It is done in company, so the loneliest hour becomes the hour of maximum society. It is time limited and ends with returning to bed, so the person is not left to fill the hour themselves, and it carries no obligation to solve anything, which removes the demand for action that the hour cannot satisfy. Every single one of those features is what a modern sleep clinic would recommend, arrived at independently, 1,000 years early, by people who had no theory of the amygdala and no word for cortisol. Set them side by side, and the correspondence is almost comical. The clinic says, get out of bed. The rule says, rise at the bell. The clinic says, do something low stimulation in low light. The rule says, candlelit chant. The clinic says, do not lie there ruminating about your problems. The rule says, the words are given to you, and they are not about your problems. The clinic says, return to bed when sleepy, without watching the clock. The rule says, return after the office, and the office ends when it ends. The clinic says, reduce the anxiety attached to the waking, because the anxiety is what perpetuates it. And the rule says, in effect, this hour is not a failure, it is the hour appointed for this, and everyone around you is awake in it too. That last one is the peace modern treatment cannot easily supply, and it may be the most powerful of them all. You can teach a person sleep hygiene. It is considerably harder to give them the conviction that their waking is meaningful and shared, and that conviction is worth more at 3 a.m. than any technique. The break goes on here, and it must, because it would be very easy at this point to tell you that the monks understood neuroscience, and they did not. They had a theology, and their explanation for the hour involved spiritual warfare, the nearness of God in darkness, and the soul's exposure without the day's distractions, none of which is a claim modern physiology confirms or could confirm. A structural parallel is not a proof, but notice what is legitimately available here, and it is not small. When people are placed in a difficult state repeatedly, for centuries, and given the task of finding something that helps, they converge on what works. Whatever story they tell about why it works, that is not science, it is something older and, in its own domain, reliable. Call it accumulated practical wisdom, tested by the only method available before controlled trials, enormous numbers of people, doing a thing over enormous stretches of time, and keeping what helped. The theory attached to it can be entirely wrong, while the practice remains entirely sound, which is a distinction our age is bad at making. We tend to assume that if the explanation is mistaken, the practice must be worthless. But a sailor who navigates beautifully while believing the sun goes around the earth still arrives in port. The Hindu traditions arrived at the same hour by a different road, treating the pre-dawn stretch as the finest time of the day for practice and prescribing structured attention to fill it. The Japanese and Chinese contemplative traditions have their own versions. Across all of them, the instruction is the same: do not lie there. Rise, attend to something outside yourself, do it with others if you can, and do not attempt to solve your life at this hour. And one honest caveat is owed here, because everything in this section could be misread by someone who needs different help. If the hour is not merely uncomfortable, but genuinely dark, if what arrives is not worry, but despair, if the thoughts turn against your own life rather than merely enlarging your problems, then the frame of this video does not apply, and no amount of understanding cortisol curves is the right response. That is a state to bring to another person, in daylight, and there are people whose work is exactly this, and who will not find it strange. The reason to say this plainly is that the small hours are, statistically, when such states are at their worst, precisely because of the mechanism we have been describing: the alarm loud, the judgment dim, the isolation total. Knowing that the hour amplifies is genuinely useful, and it is why the oldest and best advice about the darkest thoughts is to make no decision at night. But it is not a substitute for telling someone. If that is where you are tonight, the instruction is simpler than anything else in this video. Wait for morning, and then tell someone. So the shape of the hour is now visible from both sides, a biological junction that opens on schedule, in a body that has been keeping the appointment for as long as there have been human bodies. An interval that the historical record shows was ordinary, occupied, and unfeared for most of human history. A neurological state in which fear is amplified and judgment is dimmed, which produces reliable falsehoods about the future and occasional uncomfortable truths about the present. And a set of practices, arrived at independently across cultures, that handle the state with a sophistication our own age has not matched. Gather the night as it stands, a clock of 20,000 cells that sets your rhythm and answers only to light. Cortisol turning upward in the small hours, hours before you need it, and core temperature at its floor. 2,000 documents describing a first sleep and a second sleep with an ordinary waking hour between them. A laboratory in Maryland giving modern people 14 hours of darkness and watching that hour reappear, complete with a hormone profile that belongs to neither waking nor sleep. A brain in that hour with its alarm amplified, its judgment dimmed, its memory biased toward the bleak, its context absent, and its social corrections switched off. And a set of practices converged upon independently across continents that do almost precisely what a modern sleep clinic recommends. But there is still an accounting to do, and I promised it to you at the beginning. Everything in this night has objections waiting behind it, and some of them are serious enough to change what you should take away. There is a question about how much of this applies to you specifically, lying there tonight, versus how much is a general story about a general body. And there is the last question, the one that is not medical at all, about what an hour like this is for, if it is for anything, and what it would mean to stop treating a third of your nights as time stolen from you. That reckoning is where we go now. You are awake, and you are fine. That is the whole conclusion of your night, and everything else has been the work of earning it for you. But you should not take it from me before you have watched it survive the strongest arguments against it, because a conclusion you have not tested is just a comfortable noise, and comfortable noises do not hold at 3 a.m. when your heart is going. This is not a metaphor for intellectual honesty. It is the difference between something that helps you at the hour and something that evaporates the moment you need it. So here are the objections, at full strength, with no rescue attempted, until each has been allowed to land. The first is the most serious, and it is the one a sleep physician would raise immediately. It says, this is romanticizing a medical problem, and romanticizing it is dangerous. Chronic insomnia is real, and it is not what most people mean when they say they slept badly. It damages cardiovascular health, immune function and mental health. It wrecks careers and relationships. It is one of the most common and most undertreated conditions in medicine. And there is an effective treatment for it, a structured behavioral program that outperforms sleeping pills in the long run and that most sufferers have never been offered. A video telling people their waking is an ancestral inheritance, that the traditions valued it, that they should relax into the hour, risks persuading somebody with a treatable disorder to accept it as heritage instead of getting help. That objection is correct, and it must be conceded fully rather than argued with. If your waking happens most nights, lasts hours, leaves you exhausted through your days, or comes with dread rather than mere wakefulness, that is not the phenomenon this video is about, and the right response is a clinician rather than a candle. Nothing tonight is a substitute for treatment, and anyone who takes it as one has been failed by the telling. And since the objection is correct, it deserves to be turned into something useful rather than merely conceded. The treatment in question is called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and it is the recommended first-line treatment for chronic insomnia in most major clinical guidelines, ahead of medication. It typically runs 6 to 8 sessions and involves restricting time in bed to rebuild the association between the bed and sleep, getting up when awake rather than lying there, correcting the beliefs that generate sleep effort, and regularizing the schedule. Its results hold up after the treatment ends, which is precisely where sleeping pills fail. And the reason most sufferers have never heard of it is not scientific controversy. It is that there are not enough trained practitioners, and a prescription takes 4 minutes, while a program takes 8 weeks. If you have been waking most nights for months, and it is costing you your days, that is the thing to ask for by name. Everything else in this video is context. That sentence is the only actionable medical advice in it, and it is worth more than the rest. The second objection cuts at the historical core. It says the segmented sleep story has been badly oversold in popular retellings, and it has. The archival evidence is strong for pre-industrial Europe, and that is where it stops. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer and horticultural societies, which are the nearest available window onto ancestral conditions, have generally found consolidated sleep rather than a 2-phase night, with people sleeping less than we assume and waking briefly without ceremony. Ware's experiment produced the split pattern under 14 hours of enforced darkness, which is not a condition anyone actually lives in, including our ancestors in summer. So the strong claim that segmented sleep is the natural human pattern from which industrial life exiled us is not established, and you should distrust anyone who states it flatly. What survives is narrower. That segmented sleep is a genuine, extensively documented pattern under long night conditions, that modern bodies can still produce it, and that the 8-hour unbroken block has never been demonstrated to be a biological requirement by anyone, ever. That last point is the load-bearing one, and no objection touches it. It is worth dwelling on why the overselling happens, because the pattern will help you read 100 other stories. A genuine, careful, limited finding enters public circulation, and at each retelling the qualifications fall away, because qualifications are boring and the clean version travels further. Pre-industrial Europeans, under long winter nights, commonly slept in 2 phases becomes humans naturally sleep in 2 phases. Becomes your insomnia is actually your ancestral sleep pattern. And by the time it reaches a headline, it is making a promise the evidence never made. Kirk himself has been careful about this. The historian is generally more cautious than his popularizers. So the correct posture toward everything in this video, including the parts you liked most, is to hold the limited version. The limited version is this: the human night has taken more than one shape. The shape you were told was mandatory was never demonstrated to be, and your particular waking may be far more ordinary than you were led to believe. That is enough. It does not need to be more than that to change how the hour feels, and inflating it would only make it easier to knock down. The third objection is the one you may be making yourself right now, and it is the hardest to answer with evidence. It says, understanding does not help. And it has good company. This is the standard objection to every piece of psychoeducation ever produced, and it is often right. Knowing that a phobia is irrational does not cure the phobia. Knowing that turbulence is safe does not stop the hands from gripping the armrest. You can know every hormone in this video and still wake at 3 with your chest tight and your mind reaching for the worst thing available, because knowledge lives in the part of the brain that is offline at exactly that hour. The amygdala has not read any studies. It cannot be argued with. It does not respond to citations. And it has been doing its job for far longer than the part of you that finds this video interesting. Explaining a mechanism to a frightened animal does not calm it. This is a real limitation, and I will not pretend the mechanism can be talked away. But there is a specific, measurable thing that understanding does change, and it is not the waking, it is the second layer. The waking is biological and will happen regardless. The panic about the waking is interpretive, and interpretation is exactly what changes when a person acquires a different frame. Sleep researchers have a name for this second layer. They call it sleep effort, the anxious striving to sleep that reliably prevents sleep. And reducing it is a substantial part of why the behavioral treatments work at all. It is one of the great cruel jokes of physiology that the harder you try to do this particular thing, the more certainly you fail at it, and that the only reliable route to it is to stop wanting it. So the honest claim is not that this video will end your waking. It is that it may remove the story that turns 20 neutral minutes into 3 hours of suffering. Watch the 2 layers separate in a single ordinary night. You surface at 3. That is layer 1, biological, scheduled, unpreventable. Then, within about 10 seconds, the second layer arrives, and it is made entirely of sentences. You can catch it happening if you are quick, and catching it is most of the skill. Not again. I have to be up at 6. I am going to be useless tomorrow. Why does this keep happening to me? Something is wrong with me. Each of those sentences produces a small physiological response, a nudge of arousal, a tightening, and the accumulated nudges are what actually keep you awake for the next 2 hours. The waking did not do that. The commentary did. And commentary is the one part of the sequence that responds to information, because commentary is made of beliefs, and beliefs change when the evidence changes. This is not positive thinking, and it is not telling yourself that everything is fine when it is not. It is the narrower and more defensible claim that a specific sentence you have been saying for years, "Something is wrong with me," is factually incorrect, and that dropping a factually incorrect sentence is not optimism, it is accuracy. A person who surfaces at 3 and thinks, the appointment, and then simply lies there without a story attached, is running the same biology with the second layer removed. Sleep researchers can measure the difference between those two people, and it is large. That is the entire practical promise of tonight, and it is deliberately modest. The hour stays. The suffering is optional. There is a fourth objection, and it is aimed at the shape of this video rather than at any fact in it. It says the traditions have been cherry-picked. Yes, monasteries had a night office. They also had offices at almost every other hour of the day, so finding one that lands at 3 in the morning is not a discovery, it is arithmetic. Yes, several traditions valued the pre-dawn hours. Other traditions valued noon, or sunset, or the moment of waking. Assemble any set of practices from enough cultures, and you can make almost any convergence appear. This is a fair charge, and it applies to a great deal of writing that pairs ancient wisdom with modern science, most of which is worthless for exactly this reason. Here is the honest answer. The claim is not that every tradition prized this hour above all others. Several did not. The claim is narrower and checkable, that in the cultures where the practice existed, the waking was treated as an occasion rather than a defect, and that no tradition anywhere, before the industrial era, appears to have regarded ordinary night waking as a medical problem requiring correction. That absence is the interesting part. Not the presence of night prayer, which can be argued over, but the total absence of the modern reflex to pathologize in every record we have until the clocks arrived. Absences are strange evidence, and they are worth explaining, because most people have never been asked to reason from one. If a thing is universal and untroubling, it generates no complaint literature. Nobody writes a treatise on the problem of blinking. If a thing is universal and distressing, it generates enormous complaint literature, because people seek remedies, and physicians write about remedies, and the record fills with them. Pre-industrial Europe had a substantial medical literature, and it was not shy about sleep. It discusses sleeping positions, sleeping too much, sleeping too little, bad dreams, and the dangers of night air. What it does not do, anywhere, is treat waking between the two sleeps as a condition needing correction. That silence in a talkative literature is exactly what you would expect if the waking were as unremarkable to them as blinking is to you. It is not proof, since silences never are, but it is the specific kind of evidence that would be very difficult to manufacture. So what survives all four? A good deal, and none of it requires believing anything. Your waking at that hour is a scheduled physiological event, not a random failure, occurring where cortisol turns upward and temperature bottoms and deep sleep has already been spent. Human beings across 5 centuries of documented European life woke in the middle of the night as a matter of course, occupied the interval, and thought nothing of it. Modern bodies, given long darkness, still fall into that pattern, and produce during the interval a hormonal state that belongs to neither sleep nor ordinary waking. The 8 unbroken hours you are measuring yourself against was never a biological finding. It arrived with the factory whistle and the electric bulb, and the thoughts that come at that hour are systematically distorted in a direction that can be described in advance, which means they can be discounted in advance. Every one of those is either documented or measured. None of them is a comfort I have arranged for you. Take them once more slowly, because this is the version to keep. A master clock of 20,000 cells above the crossing of your optic nerves, answering to light and nothing else, scheduling every system you have. Cortisol at its floor and turning upward in the small hours before you need it. With core temperature at its nightly minimum and the heaviest sleep already spent. More than 2,000 references across 5 centuries and 5 languages to a first sleep and a second sleep, with an ordinary, occupied, unremarkable waking hour between them. A psychiatrist at the National Institute of Mental Health giving modern volunteers 14 hours of darkness, and watching that hour reappear, unprompted, carrying a hormonal signature that belongs to neither waking nor sleep, and that the volunteers described as unlike anything in their lives. A brain in that hour with its alarm amplified, its judgment dimmed, its memory tilted toward the bleak, its context absent, and its social corrections switched off, producing catastrophes on schedule, and 1,000 years of people who rose at the bell into the cold, sang words about waiting for the morning, and went back to bed. None of it is a comfort I arranged for you. It was all there before either of us. And now notice the thing that has been assembling itself all night, quietly, underneath the biology and the archives. 3 findings from the laboratories: that the body opens a waking interval in the deep night on its own schedule, that during it the mind is stripped of its usual management, and that the state is neither ordinary sleep nor ordinary waking. And 3 instructions from the traditions, arrived at with no instruments and no theory, that the small hours are when a person is most available, that one should not lie there but rise and attend to something, and that what surfaces then should be received rather than solved. The terminology differs, the structure is identical, and the break goes on one final time, because this channel has spent 3 hours refusing to overclaim and will not spend the last 30 minutes doing it. Monastic practice is not evidence about hormones, and convergence between traditions is not a scientific result. A structural parallel is not a proof, but it is a striking piece of testimony that when human beings were regularly awake at this hour, across every continent and every theology, they did not conclude that something was wrong with them. That conclusion is ours. It is about a century old, and it arrived with the alarm clock. And it is worth appreciating how much that single interpretive change costs, because it is invisible and enormous. 2 people wake at the same hour, in the same chemistry, with the same number of hours until morning. One of them belongs to a world in which this is what a night is, and lies there, or gets up and tends the fire, and is not troubled. The other belongs to a world in which sleep is a performance measured against a standard, and lies there calculating a deficit, generating arousal, and experiencing the hour as an assault on tomorrow. Identical bodies, identical hour, and one of them suffers for 2 hours, while the other does not. That difference is made entirely of belief, which means it is the cheapest possible thing to change, and the hardest to change alone, because a belief that is held by an entire culture does not feel like a belief. It feels like a fact about the world. That is what this whole night has been for, not to give you a technique, but to show you the seam where a fact turns out to be an assumption, so that the next time you are lying there at 3, you have somewhere else to stand. Which raises the question underneath the whole night, the one no measurement will settle. What is the hour for? Not what causes it. We have that. What is it for? Nobody can answer that for you, and any answer offered with too much confidence should be refused, particularly by a voice on a screen at 2 in the morning. But here is a way of holding it that costs nothing and requires no metaphysics at all. Consider what has actually been removed from you at 3 in the morning. Your usefulness has been removed. There is nothing you can produce. No task you can complete, no one you can serve. Your role has been removed. Nobody is watching, so there is no version of yourself to maintain. Your distractions have been removed. There is no screen bright enough, no errand available, no conversation to enter. What remains is a person, in the dark, with nothing to do, and no way to be anyone in particular. Our entire culture is arranged to prevent that condition from ever occurring, which is worth noticing, because it suggests the condition is regarded as dangerous, and the traditions, without exception, regarded it as the opposite. Every contemplative discipline on earth deliberately manufactures some version of exactly this state at enormous cost, through fasting and silence and solitude, and rising in the dark. The desert monastics walked into a wilderness to find it. The Buddhist retreat produces it by removing conversation and entertainment for weeks. The Jewish Sabbath produces a version of it weekly by forbidding work. The Hindu tradition sends people into forest solitude at the end of a life. Different theologies, different centuries, no contact, and one shared conviction that a human being needs, periodically, to be nobody with nothing to do, and that this condition, which everyone avoids, is where something necessary happens, and they may have been right about why. Consider what your identity is actually made of during the day. You are made of roles, the work you do, the people who depend on you, the version of yourself you present, the tasks that prove you are worth something, all of it real, all of it valuable, and all of it borrowed from circumstances that could change on any Tuesday. In the small hours, none of it is available. The person lying in the dark is not a professional, not a parent, not competent or incompetent, not ahead or behind. They are just a person, breathing, in a body, in the dark, and the terror many people feel in that hour has less to do with cortisol than with the removal of everything they normally use to answer the question of who they are. That is why the hour feels like exposure. It is exposure, not danger, not diagnosis. Exposure, in the plain sense, the removal of everything you normally stand behind, and the traditions insisted, uniformly, that what is exposed there is not a lack, but a person, and that meeting them occasionally is not optional for a life that has any depth, which is a claim you can take or leave. But notice that our culture's solution to the hour, which is to abolish it with a screen or a pill, is also a solution to ever having to meet that person, and it is worth asking whether that is a side effect or the appeal. And this is the same threshold every one of these investigations reaches, which by now you will recognize. When we followed the body's anticipation of events that had not yet occurred, the instruments were precise, and the meaning was left entirely open. When we asked what your brain does every night while you are not there, we found extraordinary machinery and no answer about what it means to be a creature maintained in its own absence. Tonight is the same shape once more. The science can tell you why you wake at 3, with clocks and hormones and a curve that turns upward. It has nothing whatever to say about what to do with the hour once you are in it, and it never will, because that is not a question measurements answer. The universe is generous with facts and silent about their significance. That silence is where a person becomes responsible for their own understanding, and there is a pattern across these investigations worth naming at the end of another one. Every time we have looked closely at something entirely ordinary, something that happens to you constantly and that you have never once examined, it has opened into something far stranger than the exotic subjects people usually chase. A night's sleep, a hunch, and tonight the most dismissible experience in the catalogue, lying awake, annoyed, at an inconvenient hour. Look at it properly, and it becomes a circadian clock older than vision, 5 centuries of forgotten documents, a hormonal state modern life has abolished, and 1,000 years of people who set alarms for it on purpose. This keeps happening, and the reason is structural. Your attention is built to filter out whatever is constant and flag whatever is new, which is efficient and mostly correct, and has one enormous cost. The most fundamental facts of your own existence, the ones present every single day, are precisely the ones you have been trained not to see. The extraordinary is not somewhere else. It is distributed through the ordinary furniture of your life, and the only requirement for finding it is the willingness to look at something familiar as though you had never seen it before. That silence, where the facts stop and the meaning begins, is where a person becomes responsible for their own understanding, which is the only place understanding has ever come from. So, practically, tonight, everything that follows can be applied at 3 in the morning by a person who is not thinking clearly, which was the design requirement, because advice that requires a clear head is useless in the 1 hour when nobody has one. If you wake and you are calm. Do nothing at all. You are in the interval, and it will close on its own. And people spent centuries in it without incident. Do not try to sleep. Trying is the failure mode. Just be awake in the dark, which is a thing human beings have done comfortably for a very long time. If you wake and the striving starts, get out of the bed after about 20 minutes and do something quiet and finite in low light. And go back when sleep returns rather than when you have decided it should. Turn the clock away from you, because the number is what converts an hour into a loss. Make no decisions and reach no conclusions about your life, because the instrument is detuned in a known direction, and any verdict reached now will have to be re-reached in daylight. And if something quiet and true surfaces, the kind of sentence you have been outrunning during business hours, write it down and take it into the morning, where it can be looked at properly. That is everything. It fits on an index card, and the whole of it can be done half asleep, which is the only kind of advice worth giving about 3 a.m. Its difficulty lies entirely in the willingness to stop fighting an hour that was never your enemy. And if you want one sentence to carry into the dark, rather than a protocol, take this one, because it is short enough to remember when the machinery is running and everything longer will have evaporated. This is the hour. It is supposed to happen. Nothing is required of me until morning. Say it, and notice what it removes. It removes the diagnosis, because the hour is scheduled rather than symptomatic. It removes the emergency, because nothing is required. It removes the calculation, because morning is when things resume, and not before. Notice how much of the suffering of that hour is anticipatory, not the discomfort of being awake, which is minimal, but the projected cost of it. The meeting you will fumble, the day you will lose. You are being tormented by a tomorrow that has not happened, in an hour when your judgment about tomorrow is measurably impaired. The clause about morning cuts that off at the root, not by promising the day will go well, but by pointing out that the day is not currently your business. 3 clauses, and each one closes a door that the second layer of suffering comes through. It will not put you to sleep. Nothing puts you to sleep on command. That is the one thing this entire subject agrees on. But it will let you lie in the hour without fighting it, and lying in the hour without fighting it is, as it happens, the condition under which sleep most often returns on its own. The traditions knew that too, which is why none of their night practices were techniques for falling asleep. They were ways of being awake. Tonight, when you close your eyes, your body will begin its schedule without consulting you. The temperature will fall. The melatonin will rise. Somewhere past midnight, the deep sleep will do its heaviest work, and then, in the small hours, the curve will turn, and the house lights will begin to come up, hours before anyone needs them. None of this will ask your permission. None of it has ever asked anyone's permission. And you may wake. If you do, you will be lying in the same hour that every generation before you lay in. The monks in their cold church, the farmer checking the fire, the woman lying awake with her thoughts in a house full of sleeping people, the volunteers in a dark laboratory in Maryland, discovering a calm they had never felt in their ordinary lives, the nurse on the night shift, checking a chart, the fisherman going out, the person in another country for whom this is the middle of an ordinary working afternoon, the mother of a newborn, who did not choose this hour and is in it anyway. Not one of them was broken. Not one of them was failing at something. They were simply awake in the part of the night that has always been awake, in a body doing what bodies do. And you are not alone in it now, either, which is worth saying plainly, because at that hour it never feels true. Somewhere tonight, in your own city, there are thousands of people lying in exactly the state you are in, at exactly the same point, in exactly the same curve. Night shift nurses moving quietly through wards, new parents in the dark with a child, people in other time zones for whom this is simply the afternoon, someone lying awake with the same worry you have, in a room like yours, who also believes they are the only one. The isolation of the hour is real as an experience and false as a fact. Every night, an enormous, silent, unaware company of human beings shares this hour with you, and has done every night for as long as there have been human beings, and will do long after. You cannot see them. It changes nothing about the darkness. But it is true, and at 3 a.m, true things are worth holding, because so little of what arrives at that hour is. You will still be tired tomorrow, and it will still be inconvenient, and nothing in this video changes the alarm clock. The morning will come at the hour the morning comes, indifferent to how your night went, and you will get up and make coffee and do the things. That is not a failure of everything you have just heard. It is the ordinary condition of being a person with a body in a world with schedules, and no understanding of cortisol has ever excused anyone from it. But you can put down one thing tonight, and it is the heaviest thing you are carrying into that hour. The conviction that your waking means something is wrong with you. It does not. It means your cortisol turned, and your temperature bottomed, and your deep sleep finished, and a very old appointment came around again. The hour is not an interruption of your night. It is part of the architecture. Think of everything that has to go right for you to be lying there at all. A clock older than eyes, running in the dark, keeping time for organs you will never see. A body that has been maintaining you every night of your life without instruction, cleaning and repairing, and filing the day away, and that will do it again tonight, whether or not you cooperate. And in the middle of that maintenance, a gap, a stretch of quiet, in which nothing is required and nothing can be done, and in which, for most of human history, people simply lay in the dark and were alive. That is what you are being handed at 3 a.m, not a punishment, not a failure of your machinery, an hour with nothing in it, in a life that has almost no such hours left, delivered to you by a body that has been keeping the appointment since long before you were born, and will keep it long after you have stopped worrying about it. So when it comes tonight, do not fight it and do not measure it. Let the room be dark and the house be quiet and the world be, for an hour, entirely elsewhere. You are not the only one awake. You never were. Lie still. Let the hour have you.